In this episode of Mind the Gap, Michael Comyn returns to the roots of the podcast, Stoicism. But this time, not to preach its virtues, but to wrestle with its critics. Is Stoicism too cold? Too passive? Too elitist? Michael shares his journey into Stoic thought and takes us through a thoughtful exploration of what this ancient philosophy can still offer in a modern world. Here's Michael.
There's a funny thing about belief systems. Once you say you're drawn to one, whether it's Stoicism, Buddhism, psychoanalysis, or just a preference for early mornings, people assume that you've swallowed the whole thing, bones and all. But I haven't, and I hope you haven't either. This episode is a little different. It's a conversation with you, perhaps even a defense, if I'm honest. While Stoicism has guided much of this podcast series, it's not, nor should be, immune to criticism. So let's step into the ring for a few rounds, not to fight, but to feel out the shape of the argument. Because a philosophy that can't take a few punches, well, it can't be worth much. Let me begin with a personal story. For over 14 years, I ran a course for people who were afraid of flying. And during that time, I kept asking myself why so many people were so anxious about something that statistically is the safest thing you can do. While digging around for answers, psychological, emotional, I came across a phrase that stopped me in my tracks. It's not what happens to us, it's how we perceive it. That was my gateway to the Stoics. That one sentence, deceptively simple, explained so much of what I was seeing. Turbulence, for example. For some, it was a terrifying jolt of vulnerability. For others, just a bump in the ride. Same event, entirely different reaction. That was the Stoic idea of perception, not denying reality, but seeing how our interpretation of it shapes our experience. From there, I was hooked. Not as a dogma, but as a lens. A lens that helped me and the people I worked with reframe fear. So let's begin with some of the criticisms. Number 1, Stoicism is about suppressing your emotions. You've heard it, I've heard it. The image is clear, a tight-lipped figure staring out into the distance, arms crossed, unmoved by death, disaster, or delight. But that's not Stoicism. That's emotional constipation. Or perhaps the public performance of Stoicism, which is not the same as the lived philosophy. The Stoics didn't tell us to suppress our emotions. They told us to understand them. Seneca, who knew sorrow intimately, wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." In other words, feeling is not failure. What the Stoics warned against was being ruled by our emotions, being tossed around by every mood, insult, or craving. That's not a strength, that's instability. Another criticism. Stoicism is passive. It tells you to accept everything and do nothing. Now this one's interesting because it comes from a half-truth. Yes, the Stoics ask us to focus on what is within our control and let go of what is not. But that's not the same as doing nothing. In fact, it's the opposite. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome during plagues, war, and political scheming. He wrote his meditations not as a leader trying to dodge responsibility, but as one trying to hold on to clarity in the middle of it all. Epictetus was born into slavery. Musonius Rufus was exiled more than once for speaking truth to power. These were not idle men. They acted clearly, decisively, and without the illusion of control over outcomes. Stoicism doesn't excuse inaction. It calls us to do the right thing without attachment to applause or reward. Cleanthes, the lesser quoted Stoic, said something that stays with me. Fate leads the willing and drags the unwilling. And it echoes something you hear in modern psychology too, especially in acceptance and commitment therapy. The idea isn't to accept hardship as some final sentence. It's to accept reality as the starting point from which meaningful actions become possible. The Stoics, long before the science, knew that resistance to reality only adds a second layer of suffering. Now let's turn to a sharper critique. Stoicism is elitist. Now it's true that many of the texts we have come from emperors, senators, and wealthy philosophers. But the story isn't that simple. Epictetus, perhaps the most practical of the Stoics, was not only a slave, but also a disabled one. He walked with a limp, possibly from abuse, and he never sought wealth. His teachings were about self-respect, inner freedom and dignity, even when all outer freedoms are gone. In more recent times, James Stockdale, who we've mentioned before, credited Stoicism, not his military training, with helping him survive 7 years as a prisoner of war. His Stoicism didn't come from a library, it came from a cell. What he found in Epictetus wasn't high-minded theory, it was an instruction for endurance, for surviving without losing himself. Yes, some Stoic texts are lofty, but the heart of the philosophy is brutally practical. It says, you're not your job title, you're not your income, you're not your success, you are your character. That's not elitist, that's liberating. Let's move to another common critique. Stoicism lacks compassion. It's too cold, too indifferent. Now this one stings a bit because there is a risk that Stoicism, when misunderstood, becomes a kind of armour. A way to turn away from suffering instead of turning towards it. A way to say, that's not my concern, when clearly it is. But Musonius Rufus, again, taught that compassion is an essential human virtue. He said, the most important and most effective training in philosophy is that which makes a man gentle, rather than severe towards others. The Stoics spoke often of community, justice, and mutual care. They believed that we're all part of a larger whole. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself, what brings no benefit to the hive brings nothing to the bee. Stoicism isn't about retreating into a cave. It's about being part of the world without being consumed by it. Now there's a fine line between detachment and disconnection. And the Stoics, when read with care, are not telling us to be indifferent to others' pain. They're telling us not to be destroyed by it, so that we may still help. Now a more modern criticism, one I hear often and one I feel the weight of. Modern Stoicism has become self-help for tech nerds. Yeah, that one. I've seen it too. The daily cold plunge, the productivity hacks, the line memes with Marcus Aurelius quotes underneath. That's not Stoicism, that's marketing. That's a strange cocktail of Silicon Valley optimism culture wearing a toga it doesn't understand. True Stoicism isn't aesthetic, it's ethical. It asks, what is a good life and how do we live with honesty, clarity and courage? It's not a shortcut to wealth or fame. It's a compass when the map is on fire. So yes, there is a trend, but beneath the noise, the real thing still exists. The words of Epictetus haven't changed, nor have the challenges we face each day. The slights, the losses, the powerlessness we sometimes feel. Stoicism, properly understood, isn't about optimization, it's about orientation. And here's a final critique I've heard. Stoicism is outdated. It's a fair point. Why turn to ancient Greeks and Romans in a world of climate crisis, AI, social upheaval, and the 24-hour news cycle? What could a man in a robe possibly say to someone stuck in traffic, awaiting test results, or caring for an aging parent? Quite a bit, actually. Although the context has changed, the human condition remains the same. We still suffer, we still grieve, we still envy and love and lash out and regret. And the Stoics, for all their flaws, wrote about these things with clarity. When Marcus writes, you could leave life right now, let that determine what you do and say and think. He's not being morbid. He's awake. He's reminding us that we don't have time to waste, not on resentment, not on vanity, and not on fear. When Epictetus says it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters, he's not excusing injustice. He's telling us where our agency begins and how it can survive even in the darkest moments. And when Cleanthes speaks of walking willingly with fate, he's not inviting fatalism. He's inviting courage. The courage to face what is without flinching and still move forward with dignity. So why do I keep returning to Stoicism? Because it offers a way to stay steady in a storm. Not unfeeling, not detached, but anchored. Because life throws up pain, failure, criticism, betrayal, waiting rooms, loss, and sudden joy. And I need a way to meet them all without losing myself. I keep returning to Stoicism because it reminds me that I'm responsible for how I show up. Not what happens, not what they say, just me, and that's enough. You've been listening to Mind the Gap. If this episode helped untangle some thoughts, do share it with someone else who might be sitting with the same questions. And if you've got criticisms of Stoicism yourself, keep them coming. The Stoics wouldn't want blind followers. They want thinkers. Until next time, hold fast, stay stoic, and mind the gap.
You've been listening to Mind the Gap with Michael Comyn. If this conversation helped you see Stoicism or any belief system with fresh eyes, consider sharing it. And if you've got your own questions or criticisms, don't hold back. Michael welcomes them. Because the Stoics never asked for silence, they asked for thought. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and mind the gap.